Greetings, YouTube. As the Buddha tells us, suffering is universal. Everyone suffers. No one doesn't. Our suffering, however, does differ. And it's important to understand that the type of suffering you experience could be unique to you. That would be a little bit surprising, but it could. And how you handle that suffering is different than how anybody else handles their suffering. And if someone tells you that they are suffering, and this is going to sound strange because you're probably going to think, duh, who would do that thing? But if someone tells you they're suffering, the first thing you should not do is argue with them. Don't tell them they aren't suffering. Don't compare them to someone else. Don't say that, hey, that person is suffering more than you, which means you're not really suffering. You are just faking it. No, it doesn't work that way. Because no matter how much they're telling you about their suffering, you don't know the entire story. You could literally be looking at a tip of the iceberg. There are people who will never be able to tell you how much they suffer. Some will be able to tell you with great detail how much they suffer, and some may only give you a little peek, and you'll never see the rest of it. And everyone's suffering is theirs. And you cannot compare people's suffering. I've got 4 functioning limbs, well, semi-functioning limbs. That doesn't mean I don't suffer. Does someone who doesn't have 4 functioning limbs suffer? They sure do. It doesn't make my suffering any less, or theirs any better, or any worse. It makes it different. It gives them different challenges. Someone that doesn't have anxiety, depression, and PTSD can still be suffering. And my weight may be less than theirs, even though I do suffer from anxiety, depression, and PTSD, because I don't know their story. So as our fellow human beings go, we should treat each other with that knowledge in mind. Now that doesn't change the fact that what people say and what people do still has an effect on the world around them. Just because you are suffering isn't an excuse to be an asshole. And just because I'm having a really bad day, it doesn't justify me snapping at somebody. It doesn't justify me being cruel to someone. Oh, well, James is just having a bad day today. That's not an excuse. Because I was raised in an abusive household does not justify me abusing my fellow human beings. It's one of the reasons I'm not a parent. Because I wanted to break that cycle, now and forever. I'm the first one in my family to not be an alcoholic. The first one not to be an abusive parent. At least on the male side. That was a conscious decision on my part. Because I didn't want to spread that suffering. Because I had experienced it, and I didn't want to pass it on to the next generation. Because at 14, I figured out, hey, you know something? I don't have to do that thing. It isn't required. And 40 years later, I'm still solid on that decision. It was probably the most cogent, most important thing I ever decided for myself at that early stage of my life. But don't tell somebody else their suffering isn't real. Don't argue with them about it. I had someone do that to me recently. I described a physical suffering I was in at that moment. That right now I am in pain. And someone tried to argue with me that it wasn't as bad as I'm describing it. And I came right back at him and said, you know something? If the situation is how you just described, it wouldn't be so bad. But it isn't as you just described it. It is as I just described it, and I'm in pain. I don't think the message got across to this person because this person doesn't like dealing with things that are inconvenient to their worldview. And I actually have a good inkling of why the person acts this way. It doesn't excuse them. but I understand. And I wish it were otherwise, but it isn't. Because this is another person that isn't dealing with their problems, isn't going out and finding the therapist they need, is in a relationship that isn't all that healthy, and doesn't know any better, and doesn't know how to get out of it, and isn't even cognizant enough to realize that they're in the pit. So while I defended myself, I tried not to be too cruel to them, even though I was in pain. And I'm having a hard time with this video today. My hands are very tight at the moment, because this is not easy for me. Because I get tired of being told my pain isn't real, or it's less than, or not as important as someone else's. And I can imagine that most of us experience that at some point in our lives. Very few of us don't. We've all had suffering. It's always been that way, always will be that way. But don't make someone else's worse. Your words and your actions matter. So make sure you choose your words and your actions carefully. No matter how deep you are in that pit, try not to bring anybody else down into it with you. Try not to spread the suffering. Try to reach down and help pull someone up. If we all do that, we'll all be better off. And that would be better now, wouldn't it?